Thank you so much, everyone. Welcome. It's great to have so many people here. I'll just give it another 30 seconds or so to let another few people arrive, and then we'll kick off. But welcome to this webinar called Making Climate Finance Work for All, Little Time Left to Agree an Ambitious New Collective Quantified Goal. So welcome, everyone. Maybe just as people are arriving, perhaps I'll just sort of get things started. We've only got a small amount of time and lots of things to cover. So just while people are arriving, I'll just get the introductions underway. So firstly, to introduce myself, my name is Debbie Hillier. I work for Mercy Corps and lead our work for the Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance. This means managing programs in Nepal, Indonesia and Jordan that build resilience at community level and leveraging that up for policy and practice change at subnational, national and global levels. I'm delighted to moderate this webinar. We've got some amazing speakers who I'll introduce very soon. And I wanted to start the session with a few important words from those who are grappling with climate change. So here are just a few quotes, just to read while people are arriving. I picked these honestly, almost slightly at random, but they represent some very powerful words of those who are, as I said, grappling with the issue of climate change and climate finance. And I hope these will help to set the context for our discussions today and provide a clear reality check on the task ahead. So we'll just pause for a moment as you read those and as a few more people arrive. So, as you all know, let's we'll kick off now. As you all know, the COP this year in Azerbaijan will agree a new climate finance goal, the new collective quantified goal, or NCQG. Whether we like it or not, finance underpins all climate action. So this is a once in a decade opportunity, and I mean that quite literally, not figuratively, once in a decade, to make an agreement that can supercharge climate action and ensure that the precious goals of the Paris Agreement can be achieved. There's a lot at stake. We've already had 2 years of debate on the new climate finance goal, and there's just a few months left. So the final technical meetings are next week in Azerbaijan. In preparation for this, 15 submissions have been made covering negotiating blocks, including Africa, Arab Group, EU, AOSIS and LDCs, as well as individual countries such as Switzerland, USA, Pakistan, Russia and others. The co-chairs have also developed a paper for discussion. It's got lots of different options in, but is significantly more focused and clearer than previous versions. There's all to play for. We're hosting this webinar to provide an opportunity to hear some of the perspectives that will guide and shape negotiations next week. We also have our own report to share that was published yesterday, Making Climate Finance Work for All. 5 steps for a robust NCQG. I won't go over this in detail because I want to provide time for you to hear from our speakers and for some Q&A. But I do urge you to have a look at this report, and these are the 5 steps in it that we are proposing for a robust NCQG. We need one that radically advances climate justice through already agreed principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities. We need one that is designed to meet the needs of those affected by the climate crisis, that provides the right kind of funding, primarily grants, and that provides accessible funding to countries in need, and that supports gender equality and human rights. So we're 2 months away from COP. What are some of the big issues still to be resolved? Well, one of the big ones is, what should the quantum be? What's the size of this new climate finance goal? Countries that haven't actually caused the crisis want to see amounts in the trillions. And of course, it's not just about that one number, but about how that funding is provided, whether it's grants or loans or whatever. And then, of course, who pays? There are legal obligations under the Paris Agreement that developed countries should pay, those countries who caused and have benefited from the climate crisis. And then what's this funding for? Mitigation adaptation, of course, and then the newer kid on the block, loss and damage, and so on. Lots of different issues. We've got some great speakers to provide their perspectives on these and other issues, and I've great pleasure in introducing them to you now. So first of all, we'll have opening remarks from Dr. Christopher Bartlett from the Government of Vanuatu. He's been a senior climate negotiator for the Republic of Vanuatu, the UNFCCC, since 2010. He's going to set the scene for us. How can the NCQG meet the needs of developing countries, and what are Vanuatu's priorities? Then we'll hear from Dr. Letitia Pettinotti, Research Fellow at ODI. She has 10 years of research experience on issues relating to economic transformation, development, and gender economics. And she'll provide some analysis on what CBDR means for the NCQG in terms of accountability, provision, and the contributor base. And finally, we'll hear a perspective from a developed country, Isabel Bartholomew, who negotiates for the UK on climate finance, working in the UK Department for Energy Security and Net Zero on a variety of topics and negotiations on finance, including the NCQG. She'll share her views on the progress to be made until COP29, key stepping stones to get there, and the UK's role in shaping the NCQG. Then we'll have some Q&A. Q&A will be at the end after all of those speakers. So please keep a note of questions and please write them in the chat. There is a special Q&A function, so please do feel free to write them there and then we'll get to them at the end. Climate finance is obviously a very broad topic. Please keep your questions focused on the subject of today's webinar on the NCQG. And without further ado, let me pass over to Dr. Christopher Bartlett from Vanuatu. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, and a very good evening from Port Vila here in Vanuatu. Let me start perhaps by unequivocally stating that climate finance truly is a lifeline for SIDS like Vanuatu, particularly as the impacts are worsening daily. We in Vanuatu are spending around about 35% of our GDP annually in responding to climate disasters, including what seems to us like a never-ending stream of Category 5 cyclones, these prolonged El Nino ENSO droughts, out-of-season rainfall, of course, sea level rise and ocean acidification, which are all causing, in a compounded way, unbelievable economic and non-economic losses and damages that are well beyond our adaptation limits and that are dwarfing our national budget capacities to respond. And those figures that I've given you, those are from what we call the peacetime years. But when the double and triple events hit us consecutively, like they did last year, those losses jumped to over 60% of our GDP. And the burden on our island farmers and fishers is absolutely unbearable. It is crippling our national development and their own development rights here in the islands. So needless to say that the climate finance that's come in so far is really a fraction of those costs. And our finance ministry is devastated when time and time again, it has to divert our limited resources away from essential services to deal with a problem that is not of our making. Those impacts are coming from fossil fuel greed and state enablement over decades. That's where the responsibility for climate finance lies. If you haven't had a chance to read the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General's new analytical study on the impact of loss and damage on human rights that just came out yesterday, do it. There is so much to be found there that is relevant to this discussion about the NCQG, the financial obligations for those who are responsible for this hole that is getting deeper and deeper daily. And a few salient findings from that report, which I think you will find relevant, is that states should be accountable for their contributions to the climate crisis, including their failures to regulate corporate activities and emissions. There's also the need for attribution and an understanding of overall responsibilities for climate impacts. And no surprise here, there is an internationally codified right to remedy under international law, which has, of course, financial implications. Now, here we're talking about the NCQG, which is seeming to us in Vanuatu less and less collective by the minute. But I really do thank those who are leading on ambition, particularly thinking about the needs and aspirations of developing countries. And specifically, I'd like to thank Mercy Corps, Concern Worldwide, Plan International, who are all part of the Zurich Resilience Alliance, for the submission, which has emphasized an NCQG that is ambitious, built on CBDR, and includes a burden sharing mechanism that truly does react and meets the needs of developing countries. When I look back at the process of the NCQG, and particularly in Bonn, there was great disappointment. I think progress was minimal and certainly unacceptable. As we know, almost everything remains to be agreed, and there are major gaps between the negotiating positions. And although we have tried to be tried very hard to be concrete in our proposals, you would have seen, I'm sure, the AOSIS proposal, we are not getting back the responses from developed countries on what they are willing to do. Mostly, we're hearing what they're not willing to do. It is time, in our view, that those who are historically responsible for the crisis to step up and deliver the resources that they have both pledged and failed to meet in the past and continue to be obligated to provide under the convention. So let me give just a few examples of what we think elements of an NCQG that is ready to meet the climate crisis head on might look like. And I'll base these interventions on an adherence to adequacy. We are unjustly losing lives here in Vanuatu, across the Pacific, and in the developing world because climate finance means of implementation is not adequate. So a couple of points. Adequacy when it comes to quantum would, as we heard earlier in the introduction, be in the trillions annually. In grant equivalent terms, new, additional, predictable, and public sector interventions and investments. A second point is that an adequate balance would we ensure that we stop only funding the profitable thing. We're serious about the uninvestable but life-saving work. And so Vanuatu is absolutely ready to begin to negotiate on the percentage of an overall goal that would be allocated to mitigation, to adaptation, with particular focus on SIDS and LDCs, as per Article 9.4 of the Paris Agreement, on loss and damage, undoubtedly, on readiness, which would help us in SIDS and LDCs to do capacity building and technology transfer, as well as an allocation to meeting the transparency provisions of the Paris Agreement. When we think about evolving needs, adequacy would mean that we recognize the dynamism of the gaps, and we would ensure that the goal would maintain its relevancy all the way to 2035. And that would mean that there would have to be some sort of a midterm review in 2030 so that we can make adjustments, as we in Vanuatu know have to be made almost every year here because of the intensity of the changes. In terms of justice, adequacy would mean that there is clarity in the goal on who puts up the cash from the developed countries. And this would enable accountability and predictability for us. Clearly, the UNFCCC already gives this obligation to developed countries, but I think it's quite clear that not all have been pulling their weight. And it seems, from our perspective, that a fair, just, and equitable burden sharing mechanism for the goals achievement would be a part of the NCQG and based on respective shares of historical emissions. In terms of transparency, adequacy would mean that we absolutely stop counting the ridiculous investments that are not climate finance. We would need in the goal an elaboration of substantive and procedural attributes to determine what can count towards its achievement. And needless to say, Vanuatu is unambiguous that any climate finance transaction that contributes to the expansion and continuation of the production of fossil fuels is not considerable as part of the goal. It pains me that I would even have to say that, but sadly it is so. As part of this transparency, we would request that developed country parties apply a classification scheme for climate finance no later than the end of next year, December 2025, which is clearly different to ODA and OOF. And finally, when it comes to adequacy of needs, we need to make sure that this NCQG ensures all developing country parties are eligible to receive climate finance, and in particular, the least developed countries and the small island developing states. In the past, when we've been talking about grant-based finance, our partners continue to demand equal consideration for loans and private sector finance. I don't know about your countries, but Vanuatu cannot afford further debt. We are drowning not only with sea level rise, but debt that is getting worse and worse. So overall, colleagues, I think the NCQG is an existential import to our efforts to address the crisis, and we are doing everything that we can with the limited resources that we have. It's not enough. And in our view, the entire integrity of the Paris Agreement is at stake because more hot air is the last thing that we can afford. Vanuatu will always aim to push the limits on political and technical ambition for climate change because we've got everything to lose. And so I would invite you all on this call to reach out. If you've got the ideas that are going to get us to this all-important NCQG milestone by COP29, please do. Developing, non-party, we are ready to work with you for the future of this planet and all of the life that depends on it. Thank you so much.
Wow, that's quite hard to follow, Christopher. Thank you for providing us such a passionate, clear, and high ambition scene setter for this session. I can see lots of clapping going on from people. Thank you, Christopher. I think you've provided us with a huge amount of substance there, as well as a huge amount of passion on how this is affecting your country and how existential this is to Vanuatu. So thank you. That's super valuable. I wanted to just pick up, I will pass on to Letitia in a minute, but one of the things I wanted to pick up was that you talked about the funding going to mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and also readiness is another thing that you added. And I think one of the things that is useful to think, and you also talked about the quantum. So we've talked about trillions, and just for those on the call who are not aware, I think the Africa Group in their latest submission called for $1.3 trillion to be provided every year. This will be both provided and mobilized finance. I'll explain that in a minute. And the Arab Group suggested 1.1 trillion mobilized, of which 441 billion is provided. As you said, we haven't had any numbers from the developed country side, except a few such as the US and Canada, who are trying to anchor the discussion around the 100 billion goal. And as a reminder, that 100 billion goal from last time was agreed back in 2009 and reflected what was politically possible, not what was actually needed. As Christopher so clearly laid out, things have very much changed since 2009, and the NCQG must be based on developing countries' actual needs and must be updated, again, as he said, as these evolve. So as such, and just to flag that there's the compilation of nationally determined contributions, a new report will be coming out very soon that will explore what these needs really are. And if I may, just quickly, it's not just one number. So we've mentioned trillions, 1.1, 1.3, others are talking about 6 trillion, but that number needs to be split into different parts. So what is provided, so that's resources supplied by developed country governments, that's public funds. And then what is mobilized climate finance, that's resources from private entities that is unlocked by public money. This was not done with 100 billion, which meant that a lot of climate finance was used to mobilize funding from multilateral development banks in the forms of loans requiring repayment. So, and just to agree again with Christopher, this provision goal must be set in grant equivalent terms. So it should not be loans, as he's very clearly described. And then there is also a view that the amount of money, that total NCQG, should be divided up into mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage to address that current imbalance, where, as Christopher said, it's those profitable interventions that are funded, but many are not quite so profitable and need the grant funding. So thank you, Christopher. I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of that, the things that you've mentioned later. Now let me pass on to Letitia. Letitia, over to you.
Thank you very much. Oops. I believe I should have taken control. Is that correct? Slides are moving. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Debbie and Christopher for this brilliant presentations. I work for ODI and I'm presenting today on behalf of the team, so Tony Kamninga and Sarah Colin Brander. I'm going to present findings from our report, A Fair Share of Climate Finance, with a specific focus on the collective aspects of the new collective quantified goal. This is because, the annual report by the co-chair to the NCQG noted that there should be further discussion on the collective aspects of implementation of the goal, whether burden sharing or broadening the contributor base. So we've heard from Christopher the importance of burden sharing. And we will hear perhaps, but it's definitely been called for by some developed countries on the broadening the contributor base. So I'll structure my presentation along these two main topics. So first, on the burden sharing. So it's been called for by many developing countries, and this really stems from the fact that the 100 billion had this undefined collective nature that meant that there was limited accountability per country, because it was about countries, developed countries, jointly mobilizing the 100 billion. So we couldn't hold accountable each country. And so there was limited incentive for countries to reach the goal if it only served to plug the gap left by others. And it also meant that there was limited recognition of developed countries' heterogeneity. So burden sharing is about apportioning whatever goal, whatever quantum is agreed on a per country, developed country basis, so that we can have greater predictability of flow, but also greater accountability, which is crucial, as we have heard. And this burden sharing arrangement, this is nothing new. So it's been mentioned under the convention when related to financial resources at COP7 as well. It was mentioned, but there was never any work towards defining what burden sharing arrangement could look like. So this is what I'm going to show. It is one example of what a burden sharing arrangement could be. So this is the ODI annual assessment, where we take the climate finance provided that developed countries have reported to the OECD, and we assess which country has provided its fair share of the 100 billion. And we base this assessment on each country's historic responsibility for climate change, so using cumulative CO2 emissions, capacity to pay, so we use GNI, and population. So this is what it could look like. And here it really shows the heterogeneity of developed countries, right? They're not that one monolithic group. So the United States, for example, would be at the top end and responsible for 45% of whatever goal is agreed, whereas Iceland at the other end would be responsible for 0.4% of what would be agreed. So if we apply this to the 2022 climate finance that developed countries has reported to the OECD, these are the findings. So first, almost half of developed countries in 2022 did not contribute their fair share of climate finance. And if we look at the worst performers, say, so Greece, the US, Portugal, and Australia, actually, we should really look at the absolute numbers. So focusing on the US, so the US would be responsible for 44 billion, but actually only provided 32% of it. So in terms of absolute number, the US should have provided 30 billion more. And Australia, very different comparison, but would have been responsible to provide an extra 1.6 billion compared to what it actually contributed. And Greece and Portugal, in terms of absolute number, actually account for less than 1 billion. Even though they are a part of the worst performers. But it should be noted that these figures really hide different disparities between developed countries' provision. And there are other countries, if we continue looking in terms of absolute numbers, which should be contributing towards 100 billion, at least 1 more billion. And so that's Spain, the UK, Canada, and Italy. But there are other countries that have provided their fair share, and the list is here, and some have even provided twice as much as their fair share, and that's France and Norway. So here what I have showed with this fair share burden sharing arrangement is really a proof of concept using the data that we have for under the 100 billion for 2022. So it really shows how we could hold each individual country accountable for a specific number so that we can improve predictability, improve accountability. So now let me turn to the second aspect, which is about broadening the contributor base, which has been called for by some developed countries. And This is because, well, countries' emissions, income, and vulnerability profiles have changed since the convention in 1992, since 2009, when the 100 billion was agreed. However, this should really be done with recognition of the spectrum of national circumstances and in line with the spirit of self-determination of the Paris Agreement. But the NCQG is an opportunity for nuanced differentiation among developing countries. And when I say developing countries, I take it because it has come to mean that non-Annex II countries. And it's especially important to have this more nuanced differentiation and this conversation because many developing countries are providing climate finance. So here we have the top 30 largest multilateral climate finance developing countries provider. And these are, and I should really underscore, these are underestimates because this is only the climate finance that developing countries have given via multilateral channels. So that's multilateral development banks and multilateral climate funds. So it does not account for bilateral. So these are underestimates. But this finance actually is seldom reported by developing countries. But this should really be front-loaded that developing countries are contributing climate finance. Which brings me to which countries could be encouraged to assess their own national circumstances with regards to their climate finance contribution. So what we have done is benchmark developing countries against developed countries' GNI per capita and emissions per capita as per 1990 and 2022. I do encourage you to have a look at the methodology in the report. I'll put the link later in the chat. So here are the first results. So in orange, you have countries that actually have vulnerabilities that are recognized within the climate regime or as per the vulnerability index of Notre Dame University. But the one that I really want to bring your attention to are the ones in the top right-hand corner, which are Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, and South Korea. These are countries that could have this national assessment of their own circumstances because they are the most on par with developed countries' GNI per capita and emissions per capita. So the two immediate takeaways from this diagram are that one, when we're talking about broadening the contributor base, it's only actually a small number of countries that should have this national assessment of their own circumstances. And the second point, and as we've seen in the previous slide, is that many developing countries are contributing climate finance, but they do not report on it. So there should be some examination of the barriers to reporting, whether capacity building or other diplomatic sensitivities. So to conclude, these different, these collective aspects, burden sharing, contributor base, all have linkages and implications for other elements that we heard from Christopher, from Debbie, in terms of structure, in terms of quantum, quality, and transparency. And all these should be discussed when or if burden sharing and broadening the contributor base come up as elements of negotiation in the upcoming discussions. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Letitia. And you've, as Christopher was asking for clarity on who pays to provide accountability and predictability, you've given us a great structure for thinking all that through. There's quite a lot of detail in there, which some of us will need to explore in detail, but really appreciate the analysis that ODI has done to provide a way of thinking about fair shares and what opening up the contributor base could mean. Basing that firmly on these principles of equity, CBDR, as outlined in the Paris Agreement. As you've said, these principles are explicitly referred to in Article 2.2 of the Paris Agreement. And it's interesting, we didn't have quite enough time to look at the data on what developing countries are already providing in terms of climate finance. So again, I think we all need to look at that again later. But it's clear then there are legitimate questions then about how much new finance opening up the contributor base would provide. I guess what's not clear, and perhaps we'll discuss this a bit later, is how to get to an agreement on opening up the contributor base in the time that we've got available. and it will be hugely, you know, as we all know, this could be a hugely politically damaging issue if it takes up all the negotiating time and energy, and is used inappropriately as a bargaining chip. And if I may be so bold, one of the aspects of this that is quite difficult to swallow for many is the push to open up the contributor base coming so hard from those countries, notably the US, but others as well, which have not paid their fair share over the years. So let's try and find a way forwards. Perhaps some language can be found in the NCQG that states clearly that finance should be provided in line with a fair shares approach, using those words specifically, based on CBDR or similar. This could open up the contributor base, as Letitia has outlined, but also makes explicit the burden sharing mechanism and thus increases accountability for existing Annex II countries. So let's explore this further in the Q&A. So finally, let me introduce Isabel Bartholomew. She's climate finance negotiator for the UK. Isabel is currently at the SCF meeting, I believe. So Isabel, I'm hoping you can hear, and let me move on slides for you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I hope everyone can hear me too, because yes, I'm currently at the SCF meeting and my hotel Wi-Fi is not as good as I might have hoped. So do let me know if at any point there are any issues with that. And also, just again, thank you for the invitation to speak. This is a really interesting and timely conversation, and also just thanks to Christopher and Letitia for their insights as well. Really looking forward to the discussion later today. Later in the next half hour or so. I've been asked to discuss progress made today on the NCQG and the stepping stones to COP29. So this is probably a slight step change from the other presentations. And just to be clear, I am speaking in my personal capacity, but I am going to try and keep this quick. This is an ever-changing area, and as this discussion demonstrates, there should be a chance for us to reflect and adapt, not just kind of state clear positions. So I'm looking forward to that. But just moving on to the next slide, the first thing I was just going to reflect on was the mandate that we're working under. So just a reminder what it is. I'm sure a lot of people on this call are aware of it already, and hopefully it should be uncontroversial, but we have seen a lot of contention around it, and it does represent the absolute baseline of what we should be working from. And it's key because acceptance of the mandate helps then shape what the goal could be and what it can look like. So 1 CP21 paragraph 53 provides guidance of the floor from the 100 billion per year, and we must take into account the needs and priorities of developing countries. It also gives us a start date for the goal, and importantly that the goal should be set in accordance with Article 9.3 of the Paris Agreement. And without going into exhaustive detail, the provision to set this goal in accordance with Article 9.3 is clear indication of the nature and key features of the goal. So setting the goal in accordance with Article 9.3 means we are tasked with giving shape to the global effort, as well as how developed countries should continue to take the lead. We need to consider and ensure that the goal represents a progression beyond previous efforts, and speaks to both a wide variety of sources and the significant role of public funds. So the new goal will be the first of its kind for this process. Others have already kind of flagged the relevance of the 100 billion and how it doesn't kind of address needs directly and wasn't designed to do so. And if we do succeed with these new goal negotiations, we are marking a new era. And the headline, as I think this conversation is showing, is that there is still a long way to go between now and COP29. So yeah, a lot of things that still need to be agreed and still need to be considered as well. So moving on to the next slide, and just going into a little bit of the context. The context we are operating under goes beyond the mandate. We must recognise the real world challenges we are seeing and how the goal can speak to them. So Dr. Bartlett's examples have provided undeniable and important demonstrations of this, and the importance of getting the goal right. And just to kind of add to some of that around kind of like the science base, for example, that demonstrates that every increment of warming makes a difference to the severity of climate impacts. So climate change is already causing severe impacts of undercurrent warming of around 1.3 degrees as an example. And again, the need to, others have spoken to it a bit already, but the need to scale up adaptation finance is clear. International support falls below developing countries' increasing needs, and it is clear that there is scope to go further. And countries with high levels of debt vulnerability are facing challenges when addressing climate change and wider development needs. So the current impacts of climate change are also leading to loss and damage, and this is likely to increase in frequency and severity. So we are looking that there's no denying that the NCQG needs to kind of adapt to kind of address those real world impacts. I would also say, and again, just noting what you were saying, Debbie, about being at the SCF, I'm speaking from Arusha, where the SCF Forum on Gender Responsive Finance has just taken place, and the experiences of attendees here as well, in relation to kind of like the gender responsive needs of finance, were really pertinent reminder, and so that's something that I do see a really important aspect of the goal on as well. But then kind of moving on to the negotiations context, which is also crucial, the GST outcome last year has so far struggled to find a home, so our process needs to take forward its decisions to maintain legitimacy. The GGA is also ongoing, and will be a pivotal consideration at the same time as the NCQG, and the operationalisation of the fund for responding to loss and damage is ongoing, and we know that keeping all parties with a clear demonstration and not just the sense of momentum is really important. So moving on to what we can expect from TED 11 and the third, oh sorry, previous slide still, sorry Debbie, but what we can expect from TED 11 and the ad hoc work programme. I've just got a couple of points here really, but this year we have continued to see clear divisions from the last session in Bonn, but we are starting to see chinks of light, but I will say that the feeling of frustration following the last ad hoc work programme was mutual. All the more seriously, it has resulted in positive progress from the co-chairs, which I think you've already spoken to, and the new kit paper is a substantive step forward in that space. But we also know and understand that not all of everyone's views will be in there. And that we need to make progress, and are looking forward to discussions on how we can build on this step whilst making sure that progress is representative of those needs and priorities that we should be thinking about. We are hopeful that this step will promote progress in the upcoming discussions, however, and just speaking from a UK perspective, we have been advocating throughout this year for progress at the technical level. It has been our view that this would help deliver the most ambitious goal that we can, and crucially we believe that the only way to find a way through is for developed and developing countries to work together and find meaningful landing zones that ensure that everyone comes out of this with their priorities reflected. So again, just echoing Christopher's points that we all need to be working together to find a strong outcome here. Just moving on to the next slide in terms of timeline and the steps that we're taking to get to agreement. We can't forget that we are now very close to COP29, and the mandated timeline for us to agree the NCQG by. The timeline on screen doesn't show everything, but is an illustration of those major milestones that we're seeing in the lead up to COP29 this year. And they do represent kind of major stepping stones for us to make progress in the NCQG. We need to remember that there are different levels of decisions taking place here. So there's decisions at the political level, heads of delegation level, and technical level, just as some examples. And so we should be also thinking about how best to use these events to progress different aspects of the goal. I will, however, emphasise that we are concerned by the prospect of getting to the stage of in-depth ministerial engagement without strong input from the technical level. So that position of kind of needing to see progress does continue from our perspective. And we know that there has been a wish, like a long-term wish, to be honest, for high-level ministerial dialogues to facilitate meaningful dialogue. But we also know that unfortunately so far that hasn't proved possible. So how we can best use these steps to have the best outcome within kind of the parameters we're set. There are also clearly aspects of the NCQG that will require political buy-in. So parties should be able to form a basis for political discussions for these conversations. We shouldn't be leading everything up to the leaders. And that's a lesson we should have learned from the 100 billion as well. So again, making sure that the goal does take into account the needs and priorities of developing countries. There is also a question on how the incoming presidency plans to manage discussions and what an ambitious outcome looks like there. And we know that the perception of success at COP29 will largely be down to the NCQG outcome, and a strong lead from the incoming presidency will be needed to steer towards that ambitious outcome that we do need. For our part, outside of the process, the UK has been supporting the Climate and Development Ministerial since our COP26 presidency. And we also see this as a crucial space to help support meaningful progress outside of the negotiations process, which helps support more ambitious outcomes inside the process as well. So just moving on to my final slide. and what the issues are that we see as key and at what level they're likely to be agreed at. So this slide outlines the most challenging issues on the left to areas we are seeing convergence on the right. And this is not to say that everything this is everything that NCQG negotiations or discussions should cover. Key outcomes remain on issues such as the impact of climate change on communities, including Indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities, and people in vulnerable situations, as well as gender equality, empowerment of women, and intergenerational equality, as well as nature co-benefits as well. So, I mean, that's just a snapshot of what we need the NCQG to be considering. But what this slide does demonstrate, however, is the key elements of the NCQG that we are hearing from the room as priority issues for parties, or that will be potentially challenging to agree on. So whilst positions still vary, we are seeing some movement towards a 10-year timeframe, and there is general agreement that the ETF will form the backbone of any transparency arrangements in the NCQG, noting that depending on the final scope of the goal, further arrangements may need to be made as well. However, there are some issues that I can frankly only see being resolved at the political level. So noting the challenges and diverging positions relating to them. So these include, for example, the quantum, structure and contributor base as top candidates. But our hope is we can narrow down agreement as much as possible and avoid escalating the whole goal. And in this context, just very quickly to speak to the UK position, we have been very clear that we see the objectives of the goal as one that focuses on the needs and priorities of developing countries. That seems very obvious to us. However, we do maintain that we need to be able to take into account developing country needs. We need to be clear about what about the needs for different types and sources of finance. So public finance will continue to be key, and the UK is committed to delivering on Article 9 obligations. But we need to move from, if we're going to be able to move from the billions to the trillions, as others have already mentioned in this conversation, we'd like to keep 1.5 within reach. We do need to be considering these other sources as well. And this is why we're envisioning a multi-layered goal that brings in wider sources of finance, but recognises that central role of public finance as well. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm really sorry. I think I slightly ran over time. I'm keen to have an opportunity for questions as well. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Isabel, and thank you for making the time during the SCF. It's really appreciated, and for giving your perspective on where we are now and what the steps are to COP, and what the key issues are, and noting that some of these are very difficult political decisions. Some of these can be resolved in a more technical setting. So we've got some time left now, and I'd like to open the floor for Q&A. Please do write your questions in the chat and in the Q&A. I don't think anyone's written anything in the Q&A, but the chat is working, so please feel free to write questions in the chat. I see, Letitia, that there's a couple in there for you that we might want to kick off with. Now, I don't think Letitia sadly has the time to go through all the intricacies of the methodology, but it is in the report, so please do have a look at that. But Letitia, do you want to just take a couple of these to start with? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, an excellent question. Methodology does matter because in this conversation, everything technical is actually political. So it is really important. So let me start by underscoring that what I presented is one example, and that these metrics should actually be the subject of political negotiations and technical conversations at these different meetings. So I'm not surprised that perhaps, someone else could calculate a slightly different fair share. So these results just all exist in parallel. Just a point on what we have measured, and you rightly so, point out the, let's say, negative climate finance flows, which relate to fossil fuel. So the data that we use is provided climate finance, so only public, and we don't account for loans, which is a strong contentious point, as Christopher Bartlett was highlighting. So it is indeed, only one reflection of actually the effort that is going towards climate finance. And please do read the entire report and the methodology.
Thank you, Letitia. And if I may add, there are a number of fair shares methodologies. So there's the ODI one, there's the CG Dev one, there's a new one on fair shares for loss and damage that's coming out very soon, if it's not quite already out there. So there are a number of these methodologies. They're all very similar, though. WRI did analysis of them and found that they are broadly similar in terms of how they look at who should be paying, fundamentally based on historical responsibility for emissions and ability to pay. Those are clearly the two key aspects that will drive all the fair share methodologies. So while they may be different around the edges, I think the broad thrust of them is very similar. And, you know, there could be scope for example, the IPCC or others to develop one that could fundamentally underpin climate finance agreements, or we continue to look at a range of these methodologies. But as I said, they all focus they're broadly speaking quite similar. I hope Letitia doesn't mind me saying that. And they all exist. The methodologies are all out there, so they can be explored and interrogated. And it's really a good time to do that. Great. Any other questions? I see one from Daphne. Please could the panel comment on the representation of LDC's experienced conflict in the negotiations on the NCQG? IRC has a report on this. Would anyone like to take that issue? How are countries that are fragile or conflict affected being represented in the NCQG negotiations, and presumably also in looking at climate finance overall? And if I may abuse my position as chair, take that last point around climate finance received by countries that are fragile and conflict affected. Mexico's of course done its own research on this and found that these countries receive very little funding. So the 10 most fragile countries received less than 1% of total climate adaptation only, but less than 1% of total climate adaptation finance in 2022. So there is a huge gap in terms of funding received by fragile and conflict affected countries. Is anyone from the panel able to comment on representation? Sorry, representation of LDCs experiencing conflict. If not, we can ask participants in the webinar to look at the IRC report. Thank you very much for flagging that, Daphne. I've got a question from John Nordbo from CARE. I wonder if the panel could comment on the issue of additionality of climate finance, as well as the need for an agreed definition of climate finance. Great questions, John. Thank you. So who would like to take that up? So additionality of finance and a definition of climate finance. I think, Christopher, you mentioned the need for a definition. Christopher, do you want to just take that one? Or at least start the conversation on that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So you would have seen in the EOSIS submission that we have proposed criteria for counting finance transactions towards the goal. And I think that this is a first step, either in a positive list or a negative list. I mentioned fossil fuel flows as being on that negative list. So without being complete in a definition, I think at least at this stage, we could all agree on certain things that can or couldn't be considered finance. And then we work towards a much more robust classification of climate finance over time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Christopher. Letitia or Isabel, would you like to add to that?
Sure, I can just jump in very quickly because I just wanted to emphasize kind of the importance of transparency around this as well, because I think that that's a clear lesson learned from the 100 billion, that clear and transparent accounting methodologies really work towards that conversation around climate finance and what it is and isn't. And I think also responds to the point that Christopher's been making about kind of those finance flows that are being are potentially being accounted for, but don't necessarily kind of meet what we would kind of consider the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, for example. I'm sorry, I think everyone's frozen for me, so I hope everyone can still hear me, but just to kind of emphasize the importance of those kind of like clear and transparent accounting methodologies as well.
Great, thank you. And in terms of additionality, I think this comes up all the time. They talk around the need for new and additional climate finance, but the fact that that has never really been unpicked in terms of what that means. So John, I think you've put your finger on something really important there, that most climate finance that's provided is not additional to development finance. And as Christopher pointed out, that can mean that countries funds that they have for their own development, health and education, gender responsive programming, etc., has to be diverted into responding to the climate crisis. Thank you for that. Oh, I've got lots of questions now. A question from Ahmed, who says, are there any potential opportunities that can promote provisions for an explicit link to the global goal and adaptation thematic targets? I don't know if any of our panel are involved in the GGA negotiations and would like to talk about how the NCQG, with obviously a focus on adaptation finance, can also link to the GGA.
I might come in here if that's okay.
Please.
I wanted to highlight something that Bartholomew mentioned earlier, which is the climate and development ministerial process, which the UK government established at COP26, and it's got a very strong focus on finding innovation and filling gaps in adaptation finance. And last year, ministers agreed on a high-level vision with a couple of themes, and the first theme was around programmatic approaches for adaptation finance. And in our experience, you really are able to look horizontally with the GGA targets with programmatic approaches. So moving away from these single intervention, short duration projects into much more locally owned holistic programs, long-term holistic programs, so that you can start to see interconnections and interconnectivity among the different the goals of the GGA. So just something to think about. There will be another climate development ministerial happening at pre-COP this year, and we hope to delve even deeper into that programmatic adaptation approach. Thanks.
Thank you, Christopher. Letitia.
Thank you. And to build on this, I guess that's where transparency arrangements are critical, because that's one of the very obvious linkages between NCQG, GGA, and other processes. And for that, we have two tools, let's say, at our disposal. We have the forward-looking reporting, so what countries are planning to provide and mobilize, and that's the 9.5 communications. And then we have the new and soon to be new, starting this year, the enhanced transparency framework, which is looking backward at how much has been provided, mobilized, etc. And there are plenty of opportunities there to provide this, granular, detailed information, be it on gender, be it on the GGA, be it on, whatever countries are doing. And that also relates to the discussion we had about climate finance definition, is that these two tools are an opportunity to enhance that accountability and transparency.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Letitia. And maybe one thing that was perhaps hinted about by the question to you, Letitia, at the beginning around Norway, perhaps or perhaps not, I don't know. But one of the things that is worth being explicit about is the way that we currently, and again, this has been mentioned a couple of times, but just to pull it out a little bit more, at the moment, we climate finance is counted at face value terms. So if there's a loan of 100 million, that's counted as 100 million. And yes, of course, that's entirely different to a grant of 100 million. And as we know, so far, at least, climate finance has been much more focused on loans. So 69% of all international public climate finance in the last few years has been made up of loans. And this clearly entrenches existing inequalities, exacerbating debt crisis, and makes the big number provided by developed countries look bigger. And in fact, in 2022, the OECD reported that 116 billion was provided by developed to developing countries. But Oxfam's work this year estimates that the true value of that 116 billion was actually somewhere between 28 and 35 billion. That's due primarily to providers counting loans at their face value, as well as somewhat generous reporting. So this issue of transparency is really, really important. And as has been mentioned, making sure that we're counting the right things and that we're counting loans at their grant equivalent value. So all ODA is overseas development aid is counted in grant equivalent terms. That's a very normal procedure for OECD, but for some reason it hasn't been used for climate finance. So the NCQG needs to make sure that this is indeed brought into NCQG and it becomes normal. So we're not inflating climate finance figures. So I hope that is I hope that's a helpful remark. Can I ask Isabel a question around, you raised this issue of public finance versus private finance. Is there anything more you can say around that, around where you see the need and the necessity for public finance and where private sector finance has a role?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Debbie. And yeah, I mean, first of all, just to say that public finance from my perspective is absolutely undeniable. Like we are seeing the evidence of the needs as you've been talking about, and it's not just about the quantum, but also the quality of that finance, right, that's being provided. So making sure it's being targeted effectively and having the greatest impact it can. And so we absolutely see that as a part of this goal and a core part of the goal. I think what I was trying to allude to is that if we are going to have this conversation about like moving from the billions to the trillions, which is a really important one to have when we're thinking about the needs and priorities of developing countries, we need to be taking advantage of all sources of finance that are relevant to that realignment. And so bringing in the private sector is a clear next step for that, both in terms of work that's already been done around kind of mobilizing the private sector, but also seeing that clear role from members of the private sector as well, as to how they can kind of have a role within the realignment and ensuring that we are kind of staying on track for 1.5 and our Paris Agreement commitments as well. So I think in terms of what that could look like, the way we're kind of envisioning it is this kind of some sort of total investment target at the top, which reflects the what number does need to be mobilized for us to be able to keep the goal on track, and then a very clear kind of like public mobilization goal underneath that as well. So having kind of different layers of the goal, as I was mentioning, to make clear that there isn't any kind of room for backsliding or moving away on the public finance element, but recognizing that there are other sources of finance that can have a role in this space.
Thank you, Isabel. And just a kind of quick follow on from that from Lydia, how can we ensure that the mobilization of private finance doesn't lead to more debt? Would any of our panel like to, yeah, Isabel, please.
Oh, sorry, I didn't. I'm jumped the gun there, so very happy if anyone else on the panel wants to speak to this as well. But yeah, it's a really, really important question, and I think that comes down to kind of how we continue to engage with the private sector as well. So there's a role in the NCQG in terms of, as I was saying, kind of emphasising the importance of quality of finance and bringing the private sector into the conversation. But we also have to recognise that there's going to be steps we need. Like the NCQG is not the end of the conversation, right? We need to be having these conversations with the private sector and ensuring that there are measures in place to ensure the quality of finance provided is as good as it can be. But others on the panel may have more to add to that as well.
Would anyone else like to come in on that? No, okay, we are getting close to the end. So let me just thank all of our amazing speakers. I think we've had some great perspectives from very different angles, but I think all has been really useful in understanding the different perspectives here, and also the huge the prize at stake, getting an ambitious NCQG that can really move things forwards globally. So I think I've only got a minute, a very small amount of time left. So perhaps just to say, remember that the NCQG is not just a number. It's not just about spreadsheets. It's not just about reporting and finance definitions, although all of that is very important. All of that can seem technical and dry, but it is actually about people, and it's about delivering climate justice. So as we look to the negotiations next week, we urge all of those involved to stay true to the spirit as well as the letter of the Paris Agreement. This is crucial for supporting the women, men and children affected by climate-induced disasters, and also for restoring trust in global climate efforts. So with that, I'll bring this to a close. Thank you again to our amazing speakers. Thank you for your questions, and we'll be following up with you after the session. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.